The black soil of the Verdun sepulchre had drunk so much blood that it no longer accepted rain. Water pooled on its surface like oil on leather, creating mirrors that reflected nothing but the gray sky above. Captain Henri Dumont pressed his boot into the mud and watched it spring back, rejecting his weight as if the earth itself had grown proud. His men waited behind the wire, their bolt-action rifles trained on the crater's edge where the invitation had been delivered 3 hours before dawn. The messenger had been a child, or what remained of one. Its mouth had been sewn shut with copper thread, and the parchment protruded from a slit in its throat like a tongue made of vellum. The boy had stood perfectly still as Dumont read the elegant script, then crumbled into ash that the wind scattered toward the enemy lines. The invitation bore the seal of Beelzebub's Order of the Fly, pressed into black wax that still writhed with movement. It spoke of parley, of terms, of a feast to celebrate the ending of hostilities between the new syncretic Orthodox and the heretic legions along this particular stretch of the front. Dumont had seen such truces before. They lasted exactly as long as both sides needed to sharpen their knives, but this was different. The invitation promised more than mere negotiation. It spoke of revelation, of secrets that would make the endless war finally comprehensible. And it was signed with a name that made Dumont's stomach clench with recognition: Baron Tiberius Malphas, the fly-crowned prince of the Seventh Circle. Dumont had killed Baron Malphas at the Battle of New Antioch 6 months ago. He remembered the way his bayonet had slid between the Baron's ribs, the wet sound of punctured lung, the way those compound eyes had gone dim as black ichor bubbled from his mouth. He had watched the flies pour from Malphas's wounds like smoke from a snuffed candle. Yet here was his signature, fresh and flowing, inviting Dumont to dine at his table. The crater that housed the feast stretched before him like a wound in the world. Where once there had been the chapel of St. Veronica, now there was only a perfectly circular depression filled with what looked like silk. But as Dumont descended the muddy slope, he realized the white fabric was not silk at all, but skin. Human skin, stretched and stitched together to form a vast pavilion that rippled with each gust of wind. The entrance was a mouth, not metaphorically but literally, a human mouth enlarged to the size of a cathedral door, its lips sewn back to create an opening wide enough for a man to walk through upright. The teeth that lined the threshold were not original to the mouth. They had been replaced with sharpened femurs, yellowed with age and carved with scripture that hurt to read. Dumont paused at the threshold and crossed himself. The gesture felt hollow, mechanical. Faith had become habit in the trenches, and habit had become desperation. He touched the blessed silver at his throat, a medal of St. Jude the Obscure, patron of lost causes. The metal was cold against his fingers, colder than the November air. Inside the pavilion, the air was warm and thick with the scent of roses and decay. The floor was carpeted with what Dumont first took to be Persian rugs, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw they were human backs. Living human backs, flayed and stretched flat, their spines forming intricate patterns that pulsed with each heartbeat. The backs were conscious. Their fingers twitched and grasped at nothing, and their muffled sobs created a constant background whisper. The ceiling was a network of stretched intestines, woven together like basketwork and lit from within by swallowed corpse candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The candles had been forced down living throats, their flames visible through the translucent skin, creating a constellation of trapped fire that provided the only illumination. At the center of the pavilion sat a table carved from a single human skull, enlarged to monstrous proportions. The bone had been polished until it gleamed like marble, and its eye sockets served as built-in candelabras where more corpse candles burned with blue flame. Around this table sat the other invitees, their faces hidden beneath ceremonial masks carved from consecrated wood and painted with the blood of martyrs. Dumont recognized the uniforms despite their modifications. There was Commander Sophia Blackthorn of the Damned Templars, her black armor adorned with the teeth of unbaptized children. Beside her sat Marshal Werner von Stauffen of the Iron Sultanate. his turban replaced by a crown of rusted barbed wire that had grown into his skull. At the far end of the table, perfectly motionless, was the unmistakable figure of Grand Confessor Matthias of the Trench Pilgrims, his cassock stained with what looked like wine but smelled like copper. And at the head of the table, occupying a throne made of fused rib cages, sat Baron Tiberius Malphas. He looked exactly as he had at New Antioch, except for the hole in his chest where Dumont's bayonet had pierced his heart. The wound had never healed. Instead, it had become a nest, and from it poured a constant stream of black flies that circled his head like a living crown. The Baron smiled when he saw Dumont, and his teeth had been replaced with tiny human skulls, each one carved with a different expression of agony. "Captain Dumont," the Baron said, his voice emerging not from his throat but from the wound in his chest, carried on the wings of the flies that poured from within him. "How good of you to accept my invitation. Please, sit. The feast is about to begin." Dumont took the only empty chair, positioned directly across from the Baron. The seat was warm, and he realized with growing nausea that it was not a chair at all, but a living person curled into furniture shape, their back hollowed out to create a seat, their arms extended to form armrests. The living chair whimpered softly when Dumont settled his weight upon it. "You are wondering how I can be here when you killed me so thoroughly," the Baron continued, his compound eyes reflecting the candlelight like black mirrors. "Death is such a limiting concept, don't you think? Here, in this blessed place where the walls between heaven and hell grow thin, death becomes merely another form of service." The Baron gestured, and servants emerged from alcoves Dumont had not noticed before. They were children, or had been once, their bodies stretched and elongated until they resembled spiders more than humans. Their limbs had been broken and reset multiple times to achieve the proper angles, and they moved with the skittering grace of things that had learned to love their pain. The first course arrived on plates made from human skulls, the brain cavities filled with what looked like black caviar but moved with its own internal rhythm. Dumont watched the other commanders begin to eat, their movements mechanical and synchronized, as if they were all responding to the same unheard music. "Please," the Baron said, noticing Dumont's hesitation. "The roe of the abyssal salmon, caught in the rivers that flow beneath Jerusalem. They say each egg contains the compressed scream of a damned soul. Quite a delicacy." Dumont touched his spoon to the caviar and immediately pulled back. The eggs were warm, and they pulsed against the silver like tiny hearts. When he looked closer, he could see miniature faces in each black sphere, their mouths open in silent shrieks. "I prefer to discuss terms first," Dumont said, his voice steadier than he felt. "The invitation mentioned an end to hostilities." "Oh, but there will be an end," the Baron replied, leaning forward so that more flies poured from his chest wound. "A most definitive end. But first we must observe the proprieties. A toast, perhaps, to celebrate this gathering of such distinguished enemies." The spider children scuttled forward with goblets carved from human femurs, their surfaces polished smooth and inlaid with silver scripture that seemed to writhe and rearrange itself as Dumont watched. The goblets were filled with wine so dark it seemed to absorb light, its surface reflecting nothing. "To the eternal war," the Baron said, raising his goblet, "and to those who serve it faithfully, in life and after." The other commanders raised their goblets in unison, their movements perfectly synchronized. Dumont hesitated, then lifted his own cup. The wine was warm against his lips, with a taste that began sweet but turned to copper and ash on his tongue. As he swallowed, he felt something move in his throat, something small and winged that struggled briefly before settling in his chest. The Baron smiled, and Dumont noticed that his compound eyes were now reflecting not just candlelight, but tiny flames that seemed to burn from within each faceted lens. "Excellent," the Baron said. "Now we may proceed with the evening's entertainment. Tell me, Captain, what do you know of the Black Grail?" Dumont set down his goblet, noticing that the wine had left a residue on his lips that tasted of metal and flowers. "Heretical nonsense. Cathar fantasies about corrupted communion. Oh, but you are so wonderfully naive, the Baron laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass mixed with the buzzing of 1,000 flies. The Black Grail is no fantasy. It sits in the deepest vaults beneath Vatican City, where the Pope keeps his most treasured heresies. It was carved from the skull of Judas Iscariot himself, blessed by the kiss that damned Christ. The Spider children brought the second course, a soup served in bowls made from infant skulls, their fontanelles still soft and pulsing. The broth was clear but moved like living mercury, and floating in it were what looked like eyeballs, but which Dumont realized were some kind of pearl, each one containing a swirling galaxy of stars. The soup of enlightenment, the Baron explained. Each pearl contains the compressed wisdom of a fallen seraph. Quite nutritious, I'm told. Dumont watched the other commanders eat with mechanical precision, their spoons moving in perfect synchronization. Grand Confessor Matthias had not spoken a word since Dumont's arrival, and now Dumont realized why. The man's mouth had been sewn shut with golden thread, and his eyes had been replaced with tiny mirrors that reflected the ceiling of burning intestines above. You are wondering about our mutual friend the Confessor, the Baron noted, following Dumont's gaze. He attempted to exorcise me last month. The ritual was quite successful, actually. It drove out all of my humanity, leaving only the divine essence of corruption. I was so grateful that I gave him the gift of eternal contemplation. Now he sees only truth, reflected infinitely in all directions. Dumont forced himself to taste the soup. The broth was warm and oddly comforting, with a flavor like childhood memories mixed with copper pennies. But when one of the pearls touched his tongue, it burst with the force of revelation. For a moment, he saw the war from above, saw the trenches stretched across Europe like infected wounds, saw the way the blood soaked into the soil and fed something vast and hungry that slept beneath the earth. He saw the purpose of it all, the careful cultivation of suffering, the way each death was a seed planted in ground made fertile by despair. He saw the angels watching from the sky, not with compassion but with the cold interest of farmers checking their crops, and he saw what was growing in the black soil, what fed on the endless offering of human pain. It was something that had been sleeping since the First Crusade, something that the opening of Hell Gate Jerusalem had not awakened but merely began to stir in its dreams. The vision lasted only a moment, but when it ended, Dumont found that his perspective had shifted. The pavilion of stitched skin no longer seemed horrifying but rather practical, efficient, a proper use of available materials. The living furniture was not torture but recycling, a way to ensure that nothing went to waste. "Ah," the Baron said, noticing the change in Dumont's expression. "The wisdom begins to take hold. Marvelous. Now, shall we discuss the terms of our arrangement?" But before the Baron could continue, the pavilion shuddered. The walls of stretched skin rippled like water, and from somewhere beyond them came the sound of artillery fire. Not the distant rumble of the front lines, but close, immediate. The whistle of incoming shells. The Baron sighed, a sound like wind through a graveyard. "It seems your subordinates lack patience, Captain. No matter. We have time yet before midnight strikes." Dumont realized with mounting horror that he had lost track of time entirely. The soup, the wine, the warm air of the pavilion had lulled him into a strange stupor. He pulled his pocket watch from his uniform and saw that it was already 11:30. He had been here for hours, though it felt like minutes. "Midnight," he said, his voice thick. "What happens at midnight?" "Why, the truce ends, naturally," the Baron replied. "And those who have partaken of my hospitality will carry my gifts back to their respective armies. Think of it as a form of evangelical outreach." The Spider children brought the third course, a roast that had once been human but which had been carved with such artistry that it resembled a lamb. The meat was perfectly cooked, pink and tender, and it smelled of rosemary and sage. Dumont's mouth watered despite himself, and he realized that whatever had been in the wine and soup had awakened a hunger he had never felt before. "Sustenance for the journey ahead," the Baron explained. Protein is so important for proper development. Dumont cut a piece of the meat and placed it in his mouth. It was delicious, better than anything he had tasted in months of trench rations. But as he chewed, he felt something shift in his chest, a fluttering sensation like butterfly wings against his ribs. The feeling was not unpleasant. It was almost comforting, like being embraced from within. The Baron watched him eat with obvious pleasure, his compound eyes reflecting 1,000 tiny flames. "Tell me, Captain, what do you feel?" Dumont paused, trying to identify the sensations coursing through his body. There was warmth spreading from his chest, and a lightness in his head that made the candlelight seem brighter, more beautiful. The horrible sights around him no longer triggered revulsion, but rather a strange aesthetic appreciation. The living carpets were not suffering but service, their pain transformed into something higher, more purposeful. "Peace," Dumont said, surprised by his own honesty. "I feel peace." "Of course you do," the Baron replied. "You are beginning to understand the true nature of existence. Suffering is not meaningless. It is the raw material from which glory is built. Every scream is a note in a vast symphony. Every death a brushstroke in a masterpiece that encompasses all of creation." The pavilion shuddered again, and this time the sound of gunfire was closer. Dumont could hear his men shouting orders, could hear the distinctive crack of the Lebel rifles his company carried. But the sound seemed distant and unimportant, like memories of a previous life. The fourth course arrived, a salad of what looked like flower petals but which Dumont realized were human tongues, thinly sliced and dressed with a vinaigrette that tasted of tears and wine. Each petal bore a different word, fragments of final prayers or love letters or confessions, and as Dumont ate them, he felt the weight of other people's last thoughts settling in his mind like sediment. "The accumulated wisdom of the dying," the Baron explained. "Their final words, preserved and concentrated. Each bite contains lifetimes of experience distilled into pure essence." Dumont found himself eating with increasing hunger, chasing flavors that seemed to unlock memories that were not his own. He remembered dying at Verdun, felt the gas burning his lungs, experienced the moment when the bullet found his heart. But these were not traumatic memories. They were revelations, glimpses into the fundamental truth that lay beneath the illusion of individual existence. The fluttering in his chest was stronger now, and when he pressed his hand to his ribs, he could feel something moving beneath his uniform. Not painful, but definitely present, as if something was growing there, taking root in the cavity where his heart should be. "What did you do to me?" Dumont asked, but his voice carried no fear, only curiosity. "I gave you a gift," the Baron replied. "A seed of transformation, planted in fertile soil. By morning, you will begin to understand your true purpose." The fifth course was the most beautiful thing Dumont had ever seen. It appeared to be a bird, perhaps a dove, but when he looked closer, he realized it was made entirely of light. Not light trapped in flesh, but light given form and substance. The creature sat perfectly still on his plate, its wings folded, its tiny head tilted as if listening to some distant song. "The distilled essence of innocence," the Baron said, "extracted from unbaptized children through a process I developed during my time in the Cathar territories. Each bird contains approximately 1 year of childhood wonder, compressed and preserved." Dumont touched the bird with his fork, and it burst into a shower of golden sparks that seemed to enter his skin directly, bypassing his mouth entirely. The taste was indescribable, like every happy memory he had ever had concentrated into a single moment. But underneath the sweetness was something else, a sadness so profound it made his chest ache with longing for something he could not name. The other commanders continued to eat in perfect silence, their movements now so synchronized they might have been parts of a single organism. Dumont realized that he too was moving in rhythm with them, his fork rising and falling with mechanical precision, his chewing keeping time with some unheard metronome. The fluttering in his chest had become a buzzing, and when he looked down he could see his uniform moving slightly, as if something underneath was testing the boundaries of its prison. The sensation was not alarming, but rather exciting, like pregnancy but accelerated, condensed into hours instead of months. "You are wondering what is growing inside you," the Baron said, noticing Dumont's attention to his chest. "They are my children, Captain. Fly seraphs, bred from the marriage of divine essence and perfect corruption. They will emerge when the time is right, and they will carry my gifts to every corner of your army." Dumont nodded, accepting this information with the same calm he might have received a weather report. The wine, the soup, the meat had changed something fundamental in his thinking. Concepts that should have terrified him now seemed merely interesting. Problems to be solved rather than horrors to be feared. The sixth course was still alive when it arrived. It looked like a human heart, but it beat with a rhythm that had nothing to do with blood circulation. Instead, each beat produced a single note of music, pure and clear, that harmonized with similar hearts placed before the other commanders. Together, they created a chord that seemed to resonate in the very air, making the corpse candles burn brighter and the intestine ceiling pulse with sympathetic rhythm. "The hearts of martyrs," the Baron explained, "still singing the songs they learned in paradise. I had them extracted while the owners were still alive to ensure the music remained pure." Dumont cut into his heart with a silver knife, and warm blood flowed over his plate like sacramental wine. But when he tasted it, the flavor was not copper but something far more complex, with notes of frankincense and myrrh and something that might have been the sound of choirs made edible. As he ate, the music grew stronger, and he realized that the hearts were not just producing sound but memory. Each bite contained fragments of divine experience, moments when the martyrs had transcended human limitation and touched something infinite. But these moments had been corrupted in the extraction, twisted into revelations of a different sort entirely. Dumont saw God, but not as loving father or righteous judge. Instead, he saw a vast intelligence that regarded suffering with the same aesthetic appreciation that a human might feel when observing a particularly beautiful flower. Pain was not punishment but art, and the greatest artists were those who could create the most exquisite agonies. The vision was so beautiful it brought tears to his eyes, and when those tears fell onto his plate, they hissed and steamed like acid on metal. The buzzing in his chest was constant now, and he could feel tiny forms pressing against his ribs from the inside, testing their strength. The sensation was oddly maternal, as if he were pregnant with something magnificent that would soon be ready to enter the world. The seventh course arrived as the distant sound of gunfire grew closer. Dumont could hear German voices now, mixed with his own men's French, which meant the fighting had reached the crater's edge. But he felt no urgency, no concern for his soldiers' welfare. They were merely the raw material from which greater things would be built. The seventh course was a soup made from tears, not metaphorically but literally. Tears collected from the dying and the bereaved and slowly reduced over low heat until they achieved the consistency of honey. The bowl was a human skull, but this one still had its eyes, and they watched Dumont as he lifted the spoon to his lips. The soup tasted of every sorrow that had ever been shed, concentrated into liquid form. As Dumont swallowed, he felt the weight of humanity's accumulated grief settling in his stomach like a stone. But instead of crushing him, the sorrow elevated him, lifted him above the petty concerns of individual existence into a realm where all pain was transformed into beauty. He could feel the fly seraphs growing stronger inside him, feeding on the sorrow, using it to fuel their development. They were nearly ready now, their wings formed, their compound eyes bright with intelligence that was both insect and divine. The Baron watched Dumont's transformation with obvious satisfaction, his own chest wound now producing a steady stream of flies that filled the air with their buzzing song. "Nearly time," the Baron said, checking a pocket watch made from a human eye that blinked each second. 5 minutes until midnight, and then the real celebration begins. The eighth course was beauty itself, distilled and served in crystal glasses that showed not reflections but possibilities. Alternate versions of reality where different choices had been made. Dumont saw himself as he might have been, a priest, a farmer, a father with children who loved him. But these possibilities seemed pale and uninteresting compared to what he was becoming. The beauty tasted of colors he had no names for, of sounds that existed only in dreams, of textures that defied physical law. As it flowed down his throat, Dumont felt his perception expanding, saw the true interconnectedness of all things, understood finally why the war was necessary and eternal. The flies in his chest were singing now, their voices joining the symphony that had been building throughout the meal. He could feel their wings beating against his ribs, could sense their eagerness to emerge and begin their sacred work. The ninth and final course was simplicity itself. A single wafer, white as snow, that looked exactly like communion bread. But when the Baron placed it on Dumont's tongue, it tasted of corruption and transcendence mixed together in perfect balance. "The body of Christ," the Baron said, "but not the Christ you know. This is the Christ of the Black Grail, the Savior who died not to redeem but to sanctify suffering. Eat and remember." As Dumont swallowed the wafer, he felt the final barrier dissolve. The flies in his chest burst free, pouring from his mouth and nose and ears in a cloud of black wings and compound eyes. But instead of horror, he felt only completion, as if he had finally become what he was always meant to be. The other commanders were undergoing the same transformation, their bodies opening like flowers to release clouds of different insects, each one carrying the essence of divine corruption to spread throughout the armies of the world. The Baron's pocket watch began to chime midnight, each tone sending ripples through the pavilion of stitched skin. The corpse candles burned brighter, and the ceiling of intestines began to contract like a vast stomach preparing to digest its contents. "And now," the Baron said, rising from his throne of fused ribcages, "you return to your armies as my apostles, carrying the gift of perfect understanding. The war will continue, but now it will have true purpose. Every death will feed the thing that sleeps beneath the black soil, and when it finally wakes, it will remake the world in its own image." Dumont stood, feeling the last of his humanity slipping away like water through his fingers. The transformation was complete, and he understood now that he had never really been alive before this moment. Everything that came before had been mere preparation for this transcendence. But as he turned to leave the pavilion, something unexpected happened. A fragment of his former self, buried deep beneath the layers of corruption, stirred to life. It was small and weak, no more than a whisper of conscience, but it carried with it the memory of his men waiting in the trenches, trusting him to return with terms for peace. For a moment, the two aspects of his nature warred within him. The transformed Dumont, filled with fly seraphs and divine corruption, urged him forward to spread the Baron's gifts to every living soul. But the fragment of humanity that remained whispered of duty and sacrifice and the possibility that some things were worth more than transcendence. Dumont paused at the threshold of the pavilion, his hand resting on the femur teeth that lined the entrance. Behind him, the Baron watched with compound eyes that reflected 1,000 possibilities, all of them ending in the same inevitable corruption. "Having second thoughts, Captain?" the Baron asked. His voice carried on wings that buzzed with amusement. Dumont looked at his hands and saw that his fingernails had turned black, and tiny flies were emerging from beneath the nail beds like splinters of living shadow. The sight should have horrified him, but instead it filled him with a profound sense of purpose. "No," he said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "No second thoughts at all." But even as he spoke, the fragment of humanity within him was screaming, begging him to remember who he had been before the wine and the soup and the terrible beauty of the Baron's revelations. It reminded him of faces: Private Dubois with his gap-toothed smile, Sergeant Moreau who kept a photograph of his daughter in his helmet, Corporal Beaumont who wrote poetry on the backs of ammunition crates. The fragment reminded him that those men were depending on him, that they had families waiting for them, that they deserved better than to become vessels for the Baron's gifts. Dumont stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the mouth entrance, and immediately felt the cold November air hit his face like a physical blow. The contrast with the warm, corrupted atmosphere of the pavilion was jarring, and for a moment, his vision cleared enough to see the world as it actually was, rather than through the lens of divine corruption. The crater was surrounded by his men, their rifles trained on the pavilion, but their faces confused and frightened. They had been watching the entrance for hours, but time moved differently within the Baron's domain, and what had seemed like a full evening's feast had passed in mere minutes in the world outside. Lieutenant Gerard ran forward as Dumont emerged, his young face creased with worry. "Captain, sir, are you all right?" We heard terrible sounds from inside, like screaming and music mixed together. And the smell, sir, like roses and corpses. Dumont looked at his lieutenant and saw not a young soldier but a collection of possibilities. Ways the boy might be transformed. Improvements that could be made to his basic human design. The flies in his chest sang with anticipation, eager to begin their work. The negotiations went well, Dumont heard himself say. "Gather the men." We returned to the trenches immediately. But even as he gave the order, the fragment of humanity within him was fighting for control, trying to force different words from his mouth. It wanted him to tell Gerard to retreat, to fall back beyond the range of contamination, to send word to headquarters about what they had discovered in the crater. The struggle between his two natures created a moment of paralysis, and in that moment, Lieutenant Gerard noticed something wrong. The young man's eyes widened as he saw the flies emerging from Dumont's fingernails, saw the way his captain's pupils had taken on a compound structure that reflected light like broken mirrors. "Sir," Gerard whispered, taking a step backward. "What happened to you in there?" The question triggered a cascade of memory, and for a moment Dumont saw himself as he truly was. No longer human, no longer the man who had entered the pavilion hours ago. He was something new, something that wore his face and carried his memories but served a purpose that had nothing to do with France or duty or the welfare of the men under his command. The realization should have brought despair, but instead it brought clarity. The fragment of humanity within him, that small, stubborn voice of conscience, suddenly understood what needed to be done. Dumont reached into his coat and withdrew his service pistol, a Lebel revolver that had served him faithfully through 2 years of trench warfare. The metal was cold against his palm, comfortingly real in a world that had become fluid with possibility and corruption. "Sir," Lieutenant Gerard said, his voice tight with fear, "what are you doing?" Dumont looked at his lieutenant, then at the men gathered around the crater's edge, and felt the full weight of what the Baron intended. These soldiers would return to their trenches carrying the gift of divine corruption, and from there it would spread to every army in Europe. The war would continue, but now it would serve a purpose beyond human understanding, feeding something vast and hungry that slept beneath the black soil. The fragment of humanity within him whispered that there was still time, still a chance to prevent the spreading of the Baron's gifts. But it would require a sacrifice that went against every instinct of his transformed nature. Dumont raised the pistol, and for a moment he was not sure whether he intended to shoot Gerard or himself. The flies in his chest sang louder, urging him to lower the weapon, to embrace his new nature fully and begin the work of transformation. But the fragment of humanity held firm, and with an effort that felt like tearing himself in half, Dumont pressed the barrel of the pistol against his own temple. "Tell headquarters," he said, his voice steady despite the war raging inside him. "Tell them to burn the crater. Burn it all. Don't let anyone else go inside." Lieutenant Gerard reached forward as if to stop him, but Dumont shook his head. "It's too late for me," he said. "But not for you. Not yet." The Baron's laughter drifted from the pavilion behind him, carried on wings that buzzed with amusement and something that might have been admiration. "Such nobility. the Baron called, but ultimately pointless. You cannot stop what has already begun, Captain. Your transformation is complete, and the flies within you carry seeds that will spread whether you live or die. Dumont felt the truth of those words settle in his chest like lead. The corruption had taken root too deeply to be stopped by simple death. Even if he pulled the trigger, the flies would survive, would find new hosts among his men, would carry their gifts back to the trenches and beyond. But the fragment of humanity within him suggested a different possibility, a solution that would require not just death but purification. Dumont looked at the corpse candles burning inside the pavilion, their flames fed by the life force of those who had been forced to swallow them. Fire was the enemy of corruption, the one force that could cleanse even the deepest contamination. Dumont lowered his pistol and instead reached into his pack for the phosphorus grenades every officer carried for marking enemy positions. His fingers closed around the familiar weight of the canisters, each one capable of burning at temperatures that would melt steel. "Sir," Lieutenant Gerard said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You can't mean to." "Get the men back," Dumont ordered, his voice carrying the authority of command one last time. "Back beyond the wire. Now." Gerard hesitated for a moment, then saluted. "Yes, sir." As the lieutenant ran to gather the men, Dumont walked back toward the pavilion. The Baron waited at the threshold, his compound eyes reflecting the phosphorus grenades with interest rather than fear. "Dramatic," the Baron said, "but ultimately futile. Fire cannot purify what has already been sanctified by corruption. You will burn, yes, but the flies within you will survive to carry on their work." Dumont paused at the entrance to the pavilion, feeling the warmth of the corrupted air wash over his face like a lover's breath. The fragment of humanity within him was fading, overwhelmed by the constant pressure of the flies that sang in his chest and the divine corruption that flowed through his veins. But before it faded completely, it whispered one last truth. That even if the Baron was right, even if fire could not stop the spread of corruption, there was still value in the gesture. Some things were worth doing not because they would succeed, but because they were right. Dumont smiled, feeling his lips crack as they stretched over teeth that had begun to transform into something chitinous and sharp. Then he pulled the pins from all 6 grenades and walked into the pavilion as the fuses began to burn. The Baron watched him approach with something that might have been respect, his throne of fused rib cages creaking as he leaned forward. "Well played, Captain," the Baron said, "but you have merely chosen the manner of your transfiguration, not prevented it. When the flames die down, when the phosphorus has spent itself, my children will emerge from the ashes stronger than before." Dumont said nothing, but walked to the center of the pavilion, where the table made from a giant skull reflected the light of the corpse candles in its polished surface. The other commanders were still seated around it, their own transformations complete, their bodies open to release clouds of insects that filled the air with buzzing song. The grenades in his hands were growing warm, the fuses burning down toward the moment of ignition. Dumont looked around the pavilion one last time, seeing it not through the lens of corruption but with the clear eyes of the man he had been before the Baron's feast began. He saw the living carpet writhing in agony, the ceiling of intestines pulsing with trapped life, the walls of stitched skin rippling with the heartbeats of those who had been transformed into architecture. He saw it all for what it truly was, not transcendence, but the reduction of human beings to their component parts, rearranged for the aesthetic pleasure of something that had never been human at all. The fragment of his former self, growing stronger in these final moments, whispered a prayer he had learned as a child, not to the god of the Baron's revelations, but to something simpler, something that valued mercy over beauty, love over perfect suffering. The first grenade detonated in his right hand, and white phosphorus bloomed like a flower made of star fire. The pain was immediate and absolute, but clean in a way that surprised him. For the first time since entering the pavilion, Dumont felt truly awake. The Baron screamed, but not with pain. The sound was fury, disappointment, the rage of an artist whose masterpiece had been destroyed before completion. The flies pouring from his chest wound caught fire and fell like burning snow onto the living carpet, which began to convulse as phosphorus ate through skin and muscle and bone. The other grenades detonated in sequence, filling the pavilion with white fire that burned hot enough to melt the silver scripture inlaid in the bone furniture. The corpse candles exploded like tiny supernovas, their trapped flames finally released to join the greater conflagration. Dumont felt his body beginning to burn, felt the flies in his chest cooking in their nests of corrupted flesh, but instead of horror, he felt something like peace. The fragment of humanity within him was growing stronger as the corruption burned away, and for a moment he remembered what it felt like to be simply, purely human. The ceiling of intestines caught fire, and burning fat dripped down like rain. The walls of stitched skin began to curl and blacken, releasing the souls that had been trapped within them. Dumont could hear them screaming, but the screams were not of pain but of liberation. The sound of spirits finally allowed to move on to whatever came after the brief agony of existence. The Baron was burning now, his compound eyes melting like black wax, his throne of fused ribcages cracking in the heat, but he was laughing, even as his body was consumed, even as the flies that poured from his wound fell dead around his feet. "You understand nothing," he gasped through lips that were already ash. "The fire changes nothing. My children are already in your blood, in your lungs, in the very air you breathe. They will survive this, and they will remember." Dumont tried to speak, tried to deny the Baron's words, but his throat was full of smoke and burning phosphorus. He could feel the flies in his chest dying, their songs fading to whispers, but he could also feel something else. Eggs, perhaps, or spores, something smaller than the flies but more resilient, something that the fire could not touch. The Baron was right. Even this sacrifice, even this purification, would not be enough. The corruption would survive in some form, would find new hosts, would spread like a plague across the armies of Europe. The war would continue, but now it would serve a purpose beyond human understanding, feeding something that slept beneath the black soil and dreamed of transformation. Dumont fell to his knees as the fire consumed him, but his eyes remained clear until the end. Through the burning walls of the pavilion, he could see Lieutenant Gerard and his men watching from beyond the wire, their faces lit by the glow of phosphorus and divine corruption made manifest. The young lieutenant was holding a field telephone, reporting the destruction to headquarters, requesting orders for what to do next. But Dumont could see something else in the boy's expression, a subtle change that spoke of influence already taking root. The spores were airborne now, carried on the smoke and wind, seeking new hosts among the living. As Dumont's vision faded, he saw Gerard lower the telephone and smile. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but Dumont recognized it. He had worn that same expression when he first tasted the Baron's wine, when the corruption began to sing in his blood and whisper of transcendence. The pavilion collapsed inward as its supporting structure of living architecture finally died, but the fire continued to burn, fed now by phosphorus and the fat of the rendered dead. White smoke rose into the November sky like incense from a corrupted altar, carrying with it microscopic passengers that would find new homes in the lungs of every man within a mile of the crater. Dumont died with the knowledge that his sacrifice had been meaningless, that the Baron's gifts would spread regardless of his final gesture. But in his last moments, the fragment of humanity within him whispered that meaninglessness itself had meaning, that the gesture mattered even if it changed nothing, that some things were worth doing simply because they affirmed what it meant to be human. The fire burned until dawn, and when the first light of morning touched the crater, nothing remained of the pavilion but ash and melted bone. The soldiers who came to investigate found no trace of the Baron or his guests, no evidence that the feast had ever taken place. But Lieutenant Gerard, writing his report in the command bunker 3 miles from the crater, paused occasionally to watch the flies that had begun to gather around the electric lights. They were different from ordinary flies, their wings bearing patterns that resembled tiny faces, their compound eyes reflecting not light but something deeper, something that spoke of purposes beyond mere insect existence. Gerard smiled as he wrote, his pen moving with mechanical precision across the pages of the report. He described the destruction of an enemy position, the successful completion of a reconnaissance mission, the unfortunate loss of Captain Dumont in what appeared to be an accidental explosion. He did not mention the dreams that had begun the moment he breathed the smoke from the burning pavilion, dreams of vast cathedrals built from living stone, of choirs that sang with voices made of screaming, of a war that would last forever, because it had finally found its true purpose. The flies gathered in greater numbers as he wrote, their buzzing creating a harmony that seemed almost musical. Gerard found the sound soothing, hypnotic, like a lullaby sung by insects that understood secrets too beautiful for human comprehension. When he finished his report, Gerard sealed it in an envelope and gave it to the runner who would carry it back to headquarters. The young private took the envelope with a salute, but as he turned to leave, Gerard noticed something unusual about his eyes. They had developed a subtle compound structure, barely visible in the bunker's dim light, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. The infection was spreading faster than even the Baron had predicted, carried not just by flies but by simple proximity, by the sharing of air and touch and human connection. Within days, it would reach the highest levels of command. Within weeks, it would cross the lines to infect the German trenches as well. Within months, every army in Europe would carry the Baron's gifts, and the war would transform from a mere human conflict into something far more purposeful. Gerard walked to the bunker's entrance and looked out at the trenches that stretched away in both directions, filled with men who would soon understand their true purpose in the grand design. The black soil was ready, prepared by 2 years of constant feeding, and the thing that slept beneath it was beginning to stir in its dreams. The lieutenant smiled and returned to his desk, where more reports waited to be written, more lies to be told about the nature of the war and the fate of Captain Dumont. The flies continued to gather around the lights, their numbers growing with each passing hour, their songs becoming more complex as they learned to harmonize with human voices. In the distance, artillery began to fire, the same mechanical rhythm that had marked every day since the war began. But now the sound was different, more purposeful, as if the guns themselves understood that they were no longer merely weapons but instruments in a vast orchestra, playing a symphony of suffering that would feed something hungry and patient and divine. Gerard picked up his pen and began to write the next report, describing imaginary skirmishes and fictional casualties, each word adding another note to the song of deception that would hide the truth of what was happening in the trenches. The flies buzzed their approval, their wings catching the light and throwing back reflections that showed not the bunker around them but glimpses of the world that was coming, the world they were helping to build one infected breath at a time. The war continued, but now it served masters that had never been human, had never known mercy or love or the simple desire to see morning follow night without horror. The soldiers in the trenches fought on, unaware that their every death fed something that grew stronger with each offering, something that would soon wake from its ancient sleep and remake the world in its own image of perfect, purposeful suffering. And in the ashes of the Baron's pavilion, something small and patient stirred among the melted bone and cooling phosphorus, something that had survived the fire and was already beginning to grow, to spread, to sing the same song of corruption that had echoed through the feast of flies and would echo through all the feasts to come.